A few years ago, I was driving home from a friend's house. Since I lived in a rural area, I often drove to town to hang out with friends. I can't remember exactly what we were doing that night, but we usually went bowling, watched a movie, or just grabbed some ice cream and hung out at the park. However, I do remember that we lost track of time, and by the time I started driving home, it was after midnight. My house was about 5 miles from the highway, and 5 miles of dark dirt roads at night, so it could be quite eerie. It's amazing how dark it gets. If the lights go out, you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I was about half a mile from the highway when my headlights illuminated a man walking along the side of the road. He was tall and burly, with a mustache and an old baseball hat. I was surprised to see him because there aren't many people in the area, so it helps to have that extra time if you need to stop for a deer or avoid a pothole. I was in my late 30s, and he seemed to be in his late 30s, but he didn't seem threatening, so I was so trusting. I slowed down, and he approached the driver's side window. "Howdy, ma'am," he said. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but could I trouble you for a ride into town?" I didn't hesitate and said, "Yeah, thanks very much. I really appreciate it." He said graciously, "Well, you're welcome. Ricky, my name is Sheila." I turned the vehicle around and drove back to the highway since, as I said, we were only half a mile in at that time, so it wasn't a huge thing to offer him a ride. He responded, innocuous as it seems, but he was so kind that I couldn't help but believe him. We spoke for a few minutes, and despite the fact that I was alone in a vehicle with a stranger, his cool attitude put me at ease. However, after 10 or so minutes, he said, "I'm really sorry to have to do this, ma'am, but I'm going to need to take your car." When he took out a revolver and aimed it directly at me, I sat there startled and incredulous, trying to understand what I was hearing. "What are you talking about?" I implored. "Like I said, I need to take the car. Let's not make this difficult." My heart almost stopped as I saw the true regret on his face for what he was doing. I stopped the vehicle and got out, "Ricky," and he grabbed the wheel. "One more thing, ma'am, I need your phone." "I can't have you contacting the cops on me," he said, adding that I simply gave him my phone without saying anything. We drove to the police station to file a report, and the officer informed me that my description matched that of a man who was wanted for several armed robberies in this and the surrounding towns. It was Ricky, who had been waiting for someone to pass by so he could take advantage of their goodwill. My entire body was shaking, and he apologized before driving off into the night. I walked for about 30 minutes before I was able to flag down a police car. I was that unlucky person. It really messed with my mind to have such a polite and friendly person turn on me in the blink of an eye. I've always been someone who tries to help others, but this made me question my entire worldview. Why should I put myself at risk for someone who might mean me harm? That's a decision we all need to make for ourselves. I don't want to give up on the world or anything, but it's just something to think about. Stay safe out there, and watch out for strangers. In September 2020, I went on a trip to Germany where most of my family and friends live except for those in California. Not to brag, but my family is incredibly wealthy, much wealthier than I can even express. In fact, my uncle is a billionaire. Because of this, I had my own personal supercar, a 2020 Lamborghini Aventador SV in Germany. I have one back in the US too. My cousins, who are also extremely wealthy, were in Germany at the same time. We decided to go for a drive on the German Abend with our supercars. For those Unfamiliar, the Autobahn is a highway in Germany with no speed limit. The group consisted of me and my cousins David, Luke, and Werner. David drove a Ferrari SF90, Luke had his Porsche 918, and Werner was in his McLaren 720s. We started our drive around 8 p.m. Before we knew it, we were going over 160 miles per hour. I was enjoying the ride when I noticed something wasn't right. David was missing from the group. I looked around to confirm, but to my horror, he was nowhere to be seen. I called my cousins and asked them to pull over. When I told them what had happened, they were just as confused and terrified as I was. There was no way David could have disappeared so suddenly at such high speed. I kept trying to call him, but he wasn't answering. In a desperate attempt, we did something risky to find David. We reversed our vehicles and drove in the other way. When we arrived at the location where David was last seen, we parked and went into the neighboring woods along the Autobahn. Less than 3 minutes later, I heard cries for help. It was David's voice. We ran towards the sound, but to our horror, no matter how fast we ran, the cries remained the same distance away from us. It was as though David, or whatever was mimicking his voice, was moving away from us while still screaming for help. We panicked, screaming and crying in frustration. We searched endlessly, but we couldn't find him. With tears streaming down our faces, we called Luke's parents, who were just as terrified as we were. They contacted the police, and we waited until they arrived. A massive search party was organized and continued for 3 days. What was strange, however, was that David's Ferrari showed no signs of any crash or incident. It was perfectly intact, not a scratch or missing item inside except for David. Everything was untouched. The search continued, but after a solid year, the case was closed. No one could explain how this had happened, unless it was some sort of glitch in the Matrix or something equally unimaginable. Now in 2022, I still miss and mourn my dear cousin. His car was returned to us, and sometimes I drive it around holding on to hope that he's okay, or at least alive and somehow waiting to be found. This incident has haunted me, making every bone in my body shiver. As unbelievable as it may sound, it is true, and yet it remains deeply unsettling. This happened when I was in my early 20s. It was the year 2003, and I was working as a taxi driver at the time. It was a job I held for several years while finishing my education. I mostly worked the late shift because it fit my schedule. After dropping off my last passenger on my way home, I drove through a new housing development along my route. I had passed through it a few times before. The size of the unfinished houses indicated a significant investment had been made in the area. During the day, the place was busy with construction workers and landscapers, but at nearly 2 a.m., all that remained were piles of lumber and lifeless. I felt a spooky feeling as I slowly moved through the construction site. There was a sign that read "Slow for Workers," but I wasn't sure if it applied at night. I chose to follow it anyway because I didn't want to risk getting a ticket as I passed a big dump truck. Other signs of the neighborhood's exclusivity included the neighborhood's border with a forest. A guy was momentarily lit by my headlights, and before I could respond, he raced up to my window. He was clearly scared, so I immediately locked my doors and made sure my windows were up. As he got close to the driver's side window, I could see that he was a clean-cut man, probably in his mid-40s, wearing a flannel shirt, blue jeans, and tennis shoes. Despite his complete terror, tears were streaming down his face, and his whole body trembled. He stood by my car, his words muffled and incomprehensible through my closed windows. Perhaps I should have driven away, but something in his desperation made me listen to him speak. "Please, sir, let me in. I have money," he begs. "I have money. I have money." A part of me wanted to assist at that moment, but we were all alone out there, and his urgent eagerness made me nervous. The guy implored, "What's coming?" I questioned, bewildered, and there wasn't time to explain. He sobbed. After a restless night, I called the police station to see if he had been found. They told me that they had sent 2 patrol cars to the location where I saw him, but nothing was there. I felt a little relieved that he had either found another ride or that my suspicions that he had bad intentions had been correct. Most taxi drivers have stories about passengers they shouldn't have picked up assaults. I decided not to let him and hold on. "I'll call the police for you." I told him no, there was no time. He insisted as I drove away, and I could hear him yelling, "Please," as he ran after my car. I drove straight to the police station and told them what had happened, and I followed their advice. A few days later, I saw a news report about a body discovered in a forest close to where I had met the man. They showed a picture of the victim, who was the man who had pleaded for my help. The reporter said that the cause of death was an animal attack, but I don't think that's true because there were no animals larger than raccoons in that forest. I clearly remember him saying that he was chasing me. If it had been an animal, he would have mentioned it. The guilt of abandoning someone in need weighed heavily on me, but there are still a lot of unanswered questions. One of the most terrifying questions is whether it is still out there. This is a true story of mine that happened one night after finishing work at around 11 p.m. Around 10 p.m., I left a fast food restaurant on the other side of town from my house. The journey took about 45 minutes, which seemed lengthy for the little pay I was making. Since I couldn't find another work, I did this. It began to rain, and by the time I left work at 11 o'clock, the roads were slick and wet. I drove cautiously for the first part of the trip because visibility was poor due to the rain. The route I took was mostly through rural areas where the roads turned into unpaved paths, so I increased my speed a little because I was tired and just wanted to get home and go to bed. Suddenly, I saw red brake lights ahead of me, so I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late, and I collided with the back of a car that was turning onto one of the country roads. I knew I was at fault even though I had slowed down, because it is well known that if you hit someone from behind, the blame falls on you. Fortunately, I was unharmed because I was able to reduce my speed before the impact, but my mind was racing with thoughts of how much this was going to cost me. I was not making much money at the time, so I pulled my car to the side of the road, turned off the engine, and wiped a tear from my cheek before going outside to check the damage. I saw that my car had a big dent and a broken headlight, which I knew would cost at least a few $100s to fix, but it could have been worse. Next, I looked at the other car that had pulled over in front of me. The driver hadn't yet come out, so I waited between the 2 cars as the rain continued to fall. I expected to be yelled at, and I felt like I deserved it. About 30 seconds later, the other car's front door opened, and a guy wearing blue trousers and a gray hooded sweatshirt emerged. He seemed to be in his 40s. He walked to the back of his car to check the damage, which seemed to be about the same as on my car, a broken tail light and a large dent, and then he looked up and approached me. I also noticed a handgun strapped to his hip, which was unusual where I lived, but seeing a fire weapon did add an extra layer of tension to the situation. He told me I was young, but I knew that if someone was hurt in an accident, you have to report it to the police because any trouble I was in would be much worse if I didn't report it. I said I'm going to call this in because it was my fault. I don't remember exactly what he said at the time, but he tried to talk me out of reporting the accident. I took out my phone to dial 911. I realized I had really messed up when I noticed a small trail of blood dripping down his face, which I assumed was from the accident. "It looks like just a scratch, buddy." His attitude changed at that point. He appeared irate and started to approach me. He wasn't explicitly threatening, but he was encroaching on my personal space and displaying dominance, which added to the tension. I immediately decided not to call, put my phone back in my pocket, and the man immediately backed down before getting back into his car. I stood there for a while, still in shock over what had happened, but as he was leaving, I remembered his license plate. I won't say what it was, but I repeated it to myself several times until it vanished into the distance. After that, I went back to my car and dialed the police. It was after midnight when I arrived, and I was exhausted, but I knew how important it was to get that guy off the streets, so I went and did my best to help the investigation in any way I could. I told them that I had been in a car accident where the other driver was hurt, but he adamantly refused to call the police. They took the situation seriously, and when I gave them the license plate number, they ran it through their system and discovered that the car had been stolen a few days earlier and used in an armed robbery. That's when I realized why the man didn't want to call the police. The damage to my car cost about $250, which I paid out of pocket. I was never charged for the damage to the other car, though I suppose the rightful owner could come after me for it. Either way, money didn't matter. What was important was getting that dangerous man off the streets. If I had been more persistent about calling the police, I have no doubt he would have done something worse. Something really scary happened to me when I was about 18 years old back in the early 1990s. I was really into cars back then, and I enjoyed working on mine. Even though I was a girl, I had a 1979 Z28 Camaro with T-tubs. In the summer, I would go cruising with my friends looking for something to do. One evening, while driving up and down the main street of a nearby city, I noticed a small red truck following us from a distance. I was with my friend Jenny, and I mentioned that I thought the truck might be following us. I pulled into the driveway of a fast food restaurant, and the truck followed, staying 3 car lengths behind. I drove out in the opposite direction, and again the truck followed. I pulled into another driveway, and the truck did the same. I repeated this several times, and the truck kept following us, always staying 3 car lengths back. Jenny and I decided to head toward home, which was about 30 minutes away. We thought the driver of the truck would eventually give up and let us go, but he didn't. He just kept following. It was getting late, and we were becoming increasingly worried because the truck had been following us for almost an hour. We didn't want to go home and let him follow us there. I decided the best thing to do would be to drive to the nearest police station. I told Jenny what I was planning, and to my horror, she grabbed the steering wheel and pulled it sharply to the right. "Where you doing, Scree? You're going to make us crash." It was bad enough that I had to worry about the truck following us, but now I had to worry about my passenger panicking and causing an accident. "No, we can't go to the police," she insisted. Then it occurred to me she somehow thought we were at fault. She believed that just cruising around had provoked the truck. Reluctantly, I drove away from the police station. As we approached a bridge, we stopped for red light on the one-way street. The truck was directly behind the car next to us. That car turned right, allowing the truck to pull forward. When I looked over, I was startled to discover that the driver had exited his vehicle without any pants, not even down to his ankles. He wasn't wearing any pants at all. I had the disturbing feeling that he may have been following us without any pants the entire time. I hit the gas pedal and ran the red light, speeding over the bridge. Somehow Jenny didn't see him when I told her. She just kept saying no way. I drove up and down a few more streets and back over the bridge, then into the country. The truck followed us for what felt like forever until we were able to finally lose him by driving really fast into the middle of nowhere. We went home and tried to forget about it. For some reason I never told my parents, and I'm not sure why. A few weeks later I saw on the news that the police were searching for a man in a small red truck. They showed his picture and it resembled the man I saw following us. I thought their description of the truck was slightly different from the one we saw, but maybe not. I've always wondered if it was him. When I was 16, my close friend Shayla and I were driving home from a visit with my distant family in West Michigan. At the time I lived in Portsmouth, Virginia. It was 11 p.m. and we were the only ones on the road. I had never taken this route before, but I wanted to avoid the toll roads this time, so we decided to try it out. Shayla and I were so engrossed in our talk that we failed to see that we were approaching an abandoned town. When I realized what was happening, a horrible sensation crept in my stomach. My companion saw that I was uncomfortable and asked if I was well. I said, "Yes, I'm fine," but it was a lie. The town was eerie, with shuttered stores, old houses with boarded-up windows, and even abandoned cars and trucks. It truly looked like a scene from a horror film. We remained silent, the air getting colder with a sense of foreboding, and after a few minutes my car started to shake, and I realized we were running low on gas. I pulled over in front of another abandoned house, which was a great place to break down. Shayla joked nervously, and I nodded, agreeing with her sarcastic remark. I took out my phone and attempted to call roadside assistance, which my parents had programmed into my contacts, but I discovered we had no cell reception. I had completely forgotten to stop at a station miles back in a different town. When Shayla and I got out of the car to try to get service, things started to feel weird. I was concentrating on trying to get reception when Shayla suddenly grabbed my arm and whispered my name. Her eyes were wide with fear as she pointed ahead and said, "There's a man standing about 10 feet away from us." I followed her gaze and saw him, a tall man about 6 feet 2 inches, standing just out of my car's headlight range. "This town is lifeless. How can anybody be here?" I was unable to talk or breathe because my heart was thumping in my chest, but at last Shayla broke the gap. "Do you need anything?" she said, and the guy cocked his head and grinned, which just made me more afraid to move. He continued to stare at us, his smile growing. "My dad is a police officer." "You are a weirdo." We sat in silence for a moment before we heard a noise coming from underneath the car. Shayla screamed and cried as I tried to remain composed. He yelled in a panic that was an error, and his expression changed to one of rage. He started to move toward us quickly, and adrenaline shot through me as we ran back into the car and locked the doors. We looked out the window, but he was gone, confused. Would my phone be able to obtain service? I finally got 2 bars, so I called the police and told them what had happened. They said they would be there in 20 minutes, which seemed like an eternity considering the circumstances, but we were stuck in the middle of nowhere, so we waited. When the call ended, the noise stopped, and I stayed on high alert, trembling with fear. I gave Shayla a tight hug as we sobbed, and her face went cold as she looked behind me toward the back window. I felt sick to my stomach, but I couldn't help but look. The man was back with 4 other people. We heard police sirens and felt a wave of relief as a police car approached. I had never been so happy to see an officer before, and by the time he got to my car, the people had vanished, shaken. 2 men and 2 women were standing behind our car, and they all gave us smiles that chilled us to the bone. I was unable to tell the police what had transpired. Shayla took over telling them everything. They offered to get us gas, but instead I begged them to take us to a hotel in a populated area and call my parents to come get us. To this day, the police have never found those people, and we've never figured out where they could have come from. My guess is that they lived in one of the abandoned buildings. I hope they block off that town someday, and I'll never take that back way again. This happened just a few days ago when I was on a road trip with my cousin James. The first was 13 and James was 21. We were driving from our grandmother's house to our aunt's house. I have a close relationship with my cousin, so my parents let me go on trips with him occasionally. The drive was about 10 hours, and we were 3 hours into it. It was 9:00 p.m. at the time, and I was quite tired, but everything seemed funny. When I saw a red Semmet outside my window, I burst into laughter. The man driving the truck was heavy set with a long wild beard. He had a creepy vibe, but I still waved at him. In response, he did a strange groping motion toward me. I found it more amusing than scary, so I laughed even harder and told James the story while mimicking the motion. James looked disgusted, but there wasn't much either of us could do. A while later, about 4.5 hours into the drive, James pulled into a rest stop. I walked into the bathroom, and when I came out, the man was standing there. He appeared to be at least 6 feet tall. I glanced up a glass door leading into the building and saw James glaring at him through the glass. I was confused, so I walked back to the car. What James told me next really creeped me out, especially after being awake for around 20 hours. The man had been staring at me and followed me into the building, mumbling. I was crying uncontrollably when James walked out and yelled at the man, threatening him. The man backed off, got back into his truck, and continued to stare at me with that grin. We quickly drove away, wanting nothing to do with him. It was around 12 a.m. when we pulled into a motel to sleep, and the rest of the night until 8 a.m. was uneventful. James told me he was talking normally, but he had to use the restroom. A few seconds later, when I was inside the car, the man was at my window once more, and he began to treat me well. We were eating breakfast at a restaurant the following morning when the same guy sat across from us. He smiled at me, and I turned to face James, who was furious. The man passed our table on his way to the restroom and touched my shoulder, then did the same on his way back, and James and I knew it wasn't an accident. James was usually late returning, but since he had known me since I was a baby, he was very protective. At that point, James couldn't contain his nerves and got up from his seat to go to the man's table. He yelled at him to leave us alone and back off, but he didn't threaten me. Instead, he cursed a lot. I felt very anxious and wanted to leave. The man got up and slapped James, then said that I had been leading him on. Their argument went on, and the police were called. After hearing this story, they decided that we could file charges because James had been assaulted, but James declined, so we continued our day without seeing the man again. A month ago, I was moving, and after the moving truck was loaded, I fell asleep in it. An hour or two later, I woke up in a town close to my new home, where my grandmother had parked at a Burger King, and I was still asleep when my 19-year-old cousin, Max, came to the passenger door and woke me up to help carry the food. I agreed, and we entered the Burger King. I am 14 years old, and I am fairly small. I am only 5 feet tall and weigh 100 pounds. We left Burger King as I sat in the moving truck sipping a chocolate milkshake and Max ordered. I tapped her arm to say I was going to the bathroom, and when I got back, I noticed an older man, possibly in his mid-50s or early 60s, staring at Max and then at me. I didn't pay much attention to it because I was still pretty groggy. I walked back to Max as she struggled to get a soda from one of the machines, and after a while she eventually got the soda. He stopped at the driver's side where my grandmother was, and she looked perplexed. "Who am I?" he asked, in the same serious tone, and then he began talking about taking care of us girls. I was scared, and memories of scary things I had read on Reddit suddenly came flooding back. He pointed at me and said, "You're a pain in the ass." I started laughing awkwardly and mumbled something, but he kept talking until I heard Max calling me and saying that I had left my fries in the bag, even though I had them with me. To fully understand the significance of this story, you need to know a little bit about me. I went over to ask her what she meant, but she quickly changed the topic to the man. After about 5 minutes, we both agreed that he was giving off creepy vibes. My grandmother then called my name to say we were leaving, but his car was in our way. He got into his car and moved out of the way. "I'm watching you," hand gesture and mouthing the words. I then grabbed my phone and called Max to make sure he didn't follow us. Fortunately, he didn't, but it still creeps me to think that he was watching us while we got our food and drinks. My early years were influenced by the 1960s and early 1970s in a small town in upstate Ohio, where there was only one stoplight at Broadway in Maine and about 40 businesses grouped in the town center. The neighborhood drugstore, soda shop, hardware store, and small grocery store were all located on one corner. I was born in 1954. Ben Franklin's, a barber shop, a gas station, a library, a post office, and a jail. The jail was set up so that you could easily get past the desk officer 9 times out of 10 and see who was inside. We never asked why anyone was there. Instead, we would run errands or bring those cigarettes if they were locked up. A few years later came the assassination of JFK, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam protests, and the hippie revolution, of which I became a part. I joined the early wave of hippies, hitchhiking across the United States and Canada for more than 3 years. My mother was not happy with this lifestyle, but I went along without money, clothes, or worries. Many people warned me about the dangers, but I disregarded their advice because I felt invincible and naive. In June 1969, when I was 14 years old, I spent the night at my friend Dina's house in a nearby town. I persuaded her to accompany me to San Francisco, where her brother lived. We crossed a cow pasture to the highway and hitched a ride, and it never took long to find one. One particularly memorable ride was on a band's tour bus bound for Chicago. We passed on that ride and carried on with our journey. Another ride took us into a Cadillac with 4 black men who were going to a party in the black area of Columbus, Ohio. We were the only white people there, but we had a great time. A nice woman even gave me a shirt, which I now realize was an attempt to hide the fact that we were a bit of a spectacle. Later, we picked up a lone hitchhiker who kept warning the driver about the trouble we could get into crossing state lines. I became agitated and told him to stop, but we didn't. The driver stopped in Iowa for gas, and as Dina and I went to freshen up, we found police waiting for us. Our parents were probably informed, but I don't recall that part. We stayed in a hotel in Reno, which was dull compared to what we expected, and after a brief stay, Dina's mother drove all the way to pick us up. We then traveled the remaining 1,900 miles to California. The trip was unforgettable, and I sang along to the radio the entire way through Nevada, especially remembering the song Mama and Papa about going to San Francisco. Despite my small-town cool, I felt out of place and unprepared for the harsh realities like drug addiction, which I witnessed firsthand at Needle Park, where I saw people strung out on drugs. Other experiences left me deeply shaken, and I wanted to go home and never return to California. I tried to persuade Dina to leave, but she refused, and I now realize how selfish that would have been. We continued to San Francisco, landing near Berkeley College and Haight-Ashbury, where the hippie scene was vibrant. Months later, back in Ohio at home, it was July, and the news was full of stories about the Manson family and their infamous killings. It was then that I realized how close I had been to being picked up by them. What if Dina and her mother hadn't been there to accompany me? What if that driver hadn't turned us into the police in Iowa? I shuddered to think what might have happened if I had been out there alone or farther away from help. I later found out that the Manson family actively recruited from Haight-Ashbury, where we spent a lot of time. I'm glad I wasn't enmeshed in that dark world, especially considering how vulnerable I was in California at the time. I recall those nights so clearly. Even though it was over 12 years ago, I was a teenager hanging out with friends at my buddy's house. We were playing video games and messing around like teenagers do, but as the night went on, it was time for everyone to head home. It was my turn to drive, and I brought my mom's minivan for the occasion. My favorite part was getting to look cool while driving. I wore some stylish sunglasses even though it was nighttime. I was happy to help out and spend a little extra time with my friends. The first 3 were dropped off without incident, but then it was Alton's turn. I knew Alton lived in a remote area, though I had no idea how far it was because I'd never been there before. We drove down a long winding road covered in gravel with forest on either side. It was so dark I could barely see the road ahead. I drove slowly because my headlights didn't shine very far even with the high beams on. After what felt like a long time, we arrived at Alton's house. It was a small, simple house hidden away in the woods. He thanked me and hopped out of the minivan. I turned around and began the long drive back. I was nervous about the return journey, mainly because it was so dark and remote. I paid close attention to every turn we had taken, repeating them in my head to make sure I wouldn't get lost. I was about halfway back to the main road when something caught my eye. There was a man standing by the side of the road. At first I thought he might be a hitchhiker, but that alone was strange because there was hardly any traffic at that hour. As I got closer, he disappeared into the woods. I felt really scared and confused. It didn't make sense to see someone walking alone, especially that far out at night. I eventually made it home and tried to forget about the strange man. It wasn't until the next day that I found out something terrible had happened. I was hanging out with my friends again and told them about what I had seen that night. Someone mentioned that one of Alton's neighbors had gone missing. I listened with fear as they continued to talk. I was convinced it had to be connected to what I had seen. The thought made my skin crawl. We called the police right then and there. I explained that I had been in the area and saw a strange man on the road. In the middle of the night, the police told me to come into the station. I went in and gave a more detailed account of what I saw. I tried to gather more information about the case out of curiosity, but they said it was confidential. Fair enough, I suppose. As the days went by, I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, but in the end, there really wasn't anything more I could do. What could I have done? Stopped my vehicle and after the guy into the dark woods. The police spent days searching the area, paying particular attention to the location where I had seen the man, but they were unable to find anything. After a few years, Alton's neighbor never came back, and I nearly forgot about the whole thing. The case must have died cold because I hadn't heard anything for a while, until one day I was watching the news and saw that Alton's neighbor's body had been found, but it was more than 50 miles away in a different part of the woods than where I had seen the man. There's no way to know for sure, but I suspect something sinister was going on those roads that night. I still can't stop thinking about that night and wondering whether it was him I saw on the road. Did he relocate the corpse to a different location because he knew I had seen him? This happened on a warm night, and in September 2013 I noticed the full moon as I drove down a deserted road. My headlights cut through the thick fog that had settled over the city. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital and I was looking forward to a quiet night at home, but fate had other plans for me. As I rounded the bend in the road, I saw two cars pulled over to the side. They were illuminated by the glow of a street light. As I got closer, I saw that there was a man being held at gunpoint by another man. I slowed as I passed. The victim was trembling and pleading with the gunman, but he was relentless in his demands for money and valuables. They didn't even seem to notice me at first. Perhaps all the commotion was distraction enough for me to go unnoticed. My hands began to shake on the wheel as I realized I was witnessing a crime in progress. I knew I had to act quickly, so I backed my car into a dark section of the road and fumbled for my phone in my pocket. I dropped it on the floor of my car, my eyes still fixated on the robbery. I reached down for my phone, not wanting to look away. I finally found it and dialed 911. Then I watched in horror as the gunman turned towards me. Until then I thought I was well hidden by the darkness, but I was wrong. I quickly hit the gas and sped away, praying that he wouldn't follow me. My hands were still shaking on the steering wheel as I drove for a few minutes, telling the police what I had just seen. When I finally pulled over to the side of the road, my phone rang, and it was the police. I didn't know how long they were on the line, but I assumed they would have heard me, only my labored breathing and perhaps a few mild expletives. When I answered the phone, the officer informed me that someone was on their way and would be there shortly. I hung up knowing that I had done the right thing by calling for help. But as I waited for the police to arrive, I noticed a car pull up behind me. At first, I thought it was the gunman because it looked like one of the ones I had seen before, but as the minutes passed, I started to feel uneasy. The driver had gotten out and was pacing back and forth behind his car as if he was waiting for something, so I locked my doors and kept a close eye on him. Just as I was about to call the police again, I noticed flashing lights in the distance, and I felt relieved that the cavalry had finally arrived. I assumed that if the other man had been the shooter, he would have left by now, so I felt a bit more at ease. But if he wasn't, then who was he? I watched through my rearview mirror as both police officers approached the other driver, who had stopped pacing and was now standing quietly by his car. Suddenly, the driver fled and ran into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. The police chased after him, but he was too quick and elusive, and for several hours they searched the area, combing through the woods and checking nearby houses, but he had disappeared. Only more questions remained after a trace. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened that night. I knew that I had done the right thing by calling the police, but I also knew that I had put myself in danger by getting involved at all. Despite the risks, I would do it all over again. The following day, I received a call from the police informing me that they had identified the driver and that he had a lengthy criminal history. They thanked me for reporting the crime and for being observant, which helped catch a dangerous criminal. My name's Ethan, and I was 16 years old when this took place. It was back in 2003, so you can figure out how old I am now if you'd like. It was a regular summer afternoon, and I had just gotten back from school. I headed straight to the basement, where I was deeply into playing Age of Empires, my favorite computer game at the time. Actually, I still play it sometimes. Even now, I had been at it for maybe 40 minutes, completely lost in the game, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I figured it was my mom returning from her job. A few moments later, I caught the sound of someone stepping onto the porch, which was located directly above the basement. Then I heard the screen door open, but strangely the main door didn't. Curious about what was happening, I decided to head upstairs and take a look. As I climbed the stairs, faint voices reached me from the backyard. Peeking through the curtains, I noticed two men standing there quietly talking and glancing toward the windows. At first I assumed they might be acquaintances of my older sister, but then I realized they were complete strangers. They were too old to be friends with either of us, at least 26 or 27. One of them was on the heavier side, wearing a blue hoodie, while the other was an average build, dressed in a plain black t-shirt. Both had short, scruffy beards. As one of them walked past a different window, a chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I tried to think of a logical reason for their presence, but nothing made sense. My parents never scheduled repairs or visits like this without letting me know, especially when I was alone. Realizing the situation might escalate, I knew I had to act quickly. I moved to the back door and cautiously peeked out through the curtains. The two men were still there, shifting around and looking uneasy. Then one of them tried to turn the handle of the back door. Thankfully it was locked. He jiggled it twice and then gave the door a hard thump, almost like he was venting his frustration. I grabbed my phone and tried to be as quiet as possible, since I didn't think they knew I was inside. I called my mom at work, and as soon as I told her what was happening, she called the police and told me to stay put. I tried to remain calm, but I could hear the men outside moving from window to window, figuring it would be safer to hide. I slipped into my closet and remained as silent as I could for what seemed like an eternity. After 10 or so nerve-wracking minutes, I finally heard the sirens. I was afraid the men were going to break a window, but they didn't, so I assumed they were worried about making too much noise that might alert someone. As the noise got closer, I heard loud shouts outside telling the men to get down and raise their hands as they left my hiding place. I cautiously looked out my bedroom window, but couldn't see much, so I moved to my sister's room for a better view. I was fortunate that these men took their time checking doors instead of forcing their way in right away, because that delay gave me the chance to call for help before things could get out of control. This happened quite a few years ago, so I apologize if some parts feel vague. I've buried this memory for reasons that will soon become clear, but I've realized that it's not something I should keep hidden. I saw the two men being handcuffed and led to a police car. The nightmare was over, and one of the officers stayed with me until my mom arrived home, which was only a short while later. About half an hour into the game, one of the players made a poor move, and Danny slammed his hand on the remote in frustration, accidentally turning off the TV. "What's your problem?" My brother Danny and I were hanging out in my room alone at home, watching a basketball game on TV. We were shouting at the screen whenever our team made a mistake. When I switched the TV back on, I remarked, but as soon as the screen loaded, we heard heavy, rapid footfall coming from below. Danny and I paused instantly, looking at the bedroom door. I turned down the TV level so I could hear it better. Danny replied in a trembling voice, "I think someone's in the house, but it's probably the cat." I tried to remain calm, but Danny wasn't taking any risks, so he got up and closed the door. I heard a click and realized that if someone had been inside, the noise may have revealed where we were. I tried to tell myself it was just the tabby cat, but more footsteps echoed. Danny mumbled, "That's not the cat," from below. His anxious countenance began to rub off on me, and I decided to take him seriously. We turned off the bedroom light, leaving the room in complete darkness. I knelt by the door and put my ear to it as Danny fumbled about for anything we might use as a weapon. Since the walls and door were thin, I assumed I would hear any sound coming from the other side, but initially there was just stillness. When I lay on my stomach and peered through the small opening beneath the door, I saw nothing at first. However, after concentrating more, I noticed a pair of scuffed work boots moving slowly down the hallway. My heart raced as I silently got back up and tiptoed over to Danny, whispering, "Someone's here." I thought Danny might faint, so I grabbed him and led him to the window. I slid it open quietly and looked down at the ground about a story below. Danny was still frozen, seemingly detached from reality, so it was up to me to act. I pried Danny's phone out of his hand. It had one of those fingerprint locks, and he put his thumb on the screen. The phone beeped loudly, and my stomach dropped as we heard footsteps racing toward the bedroom door. I quickly dialed 911 and swung one leg out the window. Suddenly, there was pounding on the door, followed by a deep, angry voice that yelled, "I'm going to get you." My heart almost stopped. I climbed out onto the porch roof and yelled for Danny to follow me. He snapped out of his daze, scrambled to the window, and climbed out. I whispered, "We need to jump." Danny hesitated on the edge of the roof, and I jumped, first landing awkwardly and twisting my ankle in pain. Then, I looked up and saw that Danny was making the sign of the cross on his chest before jumping. He hit the ground in a roll, got up, and rubbed his neck before I realized that our cat was still in my pocket. I told the 911 operator that we needed the police right away, and she reassured me that officers were on their way and told us to stay on the line. Tears welled up as we slowly made our way back toward the house, worried about what we would find. When the cops arrived, we sat on the curb, too shaken to do anything but wait. The officers searched the house, but were unable to find the intruder, so we were relieved, and brought out our cat Smokey, and I held him tightly. Although the police claimed there was no evidence of a break-in, no stolen property, and no indication that anyone had been there at all, I know what happened to us was real because I haven't slept well since that night, and now I always lock my door and keep Smokey in my room. I apologized in private for leaving him behind. Since my mom worked late shifts as a caregiver at an aged living home when I was younger, from 5:30 p.m. to 1:30 a.m., Danny placed security cameras around the house, and nothing comparable has occurred. She used to hire a babysitter for my younger brother Lucas and me, but once we were old enough we stayed home alone. We liked it because it made us feel independent and responsible. Neither of us was the type to cause trouble. We were actually pretty well behaved and good at school. We'd finish our homework without being told, then spend the rest of the evening watching TV or just relaxing. Our living room faced the street, and there was a large window near the television so we could see the sidewalk. and passing cars out of the corner of our eyes while watching. It was a calm night with only a few cars driving by and the occasional person walking. However, after a while I noticed something out. A blue minivan from the early 2000s passed by our house several times. I stopped paying attention to the show and focused on the street instead. After the van passed a few more times, I told Lucas about it. He hadn't noticed because he was engrossed in the program. We both sat there keeping an eye on the street, and sure enough, the van went by 2 more times in a span of just a few minutes. The van driving back and forth was strange, but we initially thought the driver might be lost. However, when it passed again multiple times, we began to feel uneasy. Both of us were glued to the window, but after a short while the van stopped coming, we were relieved and went back to watching TV. It was getting late, so Lucas and I decided it was time for bed. He headed upstairs, and I walked past the window to turn off the lights. That's when I saw something that made my heart race. The van was parked across the street from our house, just far enough out of view from where we had been sitting earlier. I quickly closed the curtains, but left a small gap to peek through. Inside the van, I saw a man sitting in the driver's seat. I wondered if he'd been there the entire time. It was hard to see him clearly, but one detail stood out: his eyes. They reflected the glow of the street lights, giving them a menacing, almost golden hue. I wasn't sure if he saw me behind the curtains, but he was definitely staring at our house. Panicking, I called Lucas downstairs. He looked out the window, spotted the man, and whispered, "I think he saw me." We were both terrified. After a brief discussion, we decided to call our mom at work. Normally, we prided ourselves on being independent and didn't want to disturb her. But this situation was different. As soon as we explained what was happening, she left work immediately and drove home. Less than 15 minutes later, we saw her car pull into the driveway. I looked back toward the street, but the van was gone. It must have left the moment my mom arrived. We never found out who the man was or what he wanted. My mom reported the incident to the police, but without a license plate number, there wasn't much they could do. The experience shook all of us, and for about a year afterward, my mom hired a babysitter again when she worked nights. My name is Alex, and this story is about one of the first times my parents left me home by myself. I was probably around 11 or 12 back then. They had started leaving me alone occasionally when I was about 9. Looking back, I realized that might be considered a bit young, but that's just how things were in my family. My mom had a strict rule: never answer the door or the phone when no one else was home. Of course, I didn't always follow the rules. Sometimes I'd pick up the phone, especially if I thought it might be one of my friends. I was watching TV in the living room at around 8 p.m. when the doorbell rang. At first, I ignored it and continued watching my show, but then curiosity got the better of me, so I got up and walked toward the front of the house. I didn't intend to open the door. I just wanted to sneak a peek through the window to see who it was. Missing a call from them felt like missing out at the time, because my dad was away on a work trip and my mom had gone out for something I can't quite recall. Standing, a man in his 40s was wearing what appeared to be a work uniform. He was wearing a blue shirt with a collar and a name tag, but I couldn't make out what it was. I was only observing him for a few seconds when he turned to face me. Our eyes locked, and I froze as he waved and said, "Hey kid, we got a report of a gas problem. Can you let me in?" My heart raced as I quickly closed the curtain and backed away from the window. I knew I wasn't supposed to open the door, but the idea of a gas problem sounded serious. Hesitating, I finally unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. The man was cheerful and polite. He explained that he needed to check the gas lines inside the house. I told him I wasn't supposed to let strangers in, but he then asked, "Can I speak with your mom or dad?" That's when I felt a chill run down my spine. It hit me that if I admitted I was alone, he could do whatever he wanted. He was probably trying to figure that out. As soon as I opened the door, panicking, I tried to come up with a lie. The best I could manage was to tell him that my dad was in the shower. I hoped that would buy me a little time. We stood there awkwardly for what felt like forever. The tension was unbearable, and I felt like I might cry. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw one of my neighbors across the street walking her dog. She spotted me on the porch with the man and must have sensed something was off. As soon as he noticed her heading our way, his demeanor changed. He turned, walked briskly back to a white van parked nearby, got in, and drove off without saying a word. My neighbor called out to me asking who that man was. I told her what had happened, that he claimed to be from the gas company and was checking for a leak. She stayed calm, but firmly told me to go back inside while she called my mom. I learned a valuable lesson. That night could have been much worse, and I'll never forget how terrifying it felt to be in that situation. My mom came home in a hurry, and when she heard what had happened, she called the police right away. Later, my mom called the gas company, and they confirmed that they hadn't sent anyone out and that there were no reports of a gas issue. We never found out who that man was or what he wanted, but that night could have been much worse. This incident occurred during Thanksgiving last year, and all of my housemates went home to celebrate with their families. I'm a 26-year-old woman who lived in a house with some of my old college friends. We had all graduated about 5 years prior, but fortunately we ended up working in the same city, so we decided to move in together. However, I have a tense relationship with my parents, so I remained home and had the whole house to myself. In addition, I wanted to go to a small business gathering at a local pub, where we had some drinks and spoke about work for a few hours at about 10 o'clock at night. I made the decision to go home early in order to unwind with Netflix and get into bed at a respectable hour. When the car arrived, I waited on the curb for it. I got into the back seat, and the driver, a bald man in his mid-40s, was friendly and chatty, even though I wasn't in the mood to talk. He asked me casual questions about my plans for the evening, and when I told him that I had been out with coworkers and that my housemates were away for Thanksgiving, he laughed awkwardly and said, "So you're home alone tonight?" He gave me a quick smile as he looked at me in the rearview mirror. My stomach dropped. I realized I'd made a mistake by telling a stranger I was alone and had already shared my home address. I tried to brush off the uneasy feeling, convincing myself he was probably harmless. When we reached my house, I thanked him and got out. After walking inside and locking the front door, I peeked out the window and felt a wave of relief as I watched the car drive away. I changed into my pajamas and settled into bed watching something on my laptop. That's when I heard a long, slow, creaking noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like a door being opened carefully. My heart sank as I realized I hadn't checked or locked the back door. I quickly shut my laptop, placing it on my nightstand, and stood by my bedroom door, straining to hear any sounds. A faint but unmistakable noise reached my ears. Footsteps moving around downstairs. Someone was inside the house. I panicked for a moment, but managed to keep myself composed. I moved my dresser in front of the door, hoping to barricade it. But the sound of footsteps grew louder and faster. My heart raced as I realized that blocking the door had likely revealed my location. I darted into the closet and whispered a call to 911. The operator reassured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay as calm as possible. They said it would only take a few minutes, but those minutes felt endless. Then I heard a pounding on my bedroom door. Whoever was on the other side was trying to break in. The dresser wouldn't hold for long. Desperate, I shouted that the police were on their way. To my relief, the noise stopped moments later. The sound of sirens filled the air. A few tense minutes passed before a female officer knocked on my door and assured me it was safe to come out. She explained they had apprehended the intruder. As I stepped outside, I told her about the unsettling interaction I'd had with my ride earlier. When we walked out to the street, I froze. Sitting in the back of a police car was the man who had driven me home. The same Uber driver. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't heard that creak from downstairs. It's terrifying to think about. If there's one lesson from this ordeal, it's this: never share too much with a stranger, especially if you're home alone. My name is Ethan and I live in what many believe to be a haunted house in Calgary, Alberta. My mom and sister were convinced of this long before I was. I used to doubt the idea of ghosts until something eerie happened to me. I'm 20 now, but this story takes place when I was 18 during the middle of July. Let me first share some of the strange things that occurred to my mom and sister before my own experience. Both my mom and sister had episodes of sleep paralysis in our house, something they had never experienced before moving here. They described it like this: they would wake up feeling like a heavy weight was pressing on their chests, as though someone was sitting on them. They were unable to speak or move, which, if you think about it, is terrifying. Another thing that happened to both of them was that their blankets were pulled off while they were sleeping. My sister had this happen multiple times, but my mom only had it happen once. Now that you know the background, I'll tell you about the event that made me a believer. On a Saturday, my mom had taken my sister to her swimming lessons. I was home alone in my room playing online games with a friend. After we logged off, I said goodbye on the call, shut down my computer, and flopped onto my bed. I opened up YouTube to watch a new video by my favorite content creator. As I lay there, I began to hear noises coming from the kitchen. It sounded like someone was moving dishes in the sink. This struck me as odd because I was alone in the house. I paused, listening closely. Soon I heard what sounded like cabinets opening and closing. Being a bit naive, I assumed my mom and sister must have returned early. I walked down the hallway to check, but to my shock it wasn't them, and instead, at the far end of the hall leading to the kitchen, I saw a shadowy figure, like a dark misty outline of a person. I froze, completely stunned. I couldn't wrap my head around what I was seeing. After what felt like forever, I bolted back to my room and slammed the door shut. I pressed my body against it, trying to keep it closed even though nothing was chasing me. My phone was on the bed, so I slid over to grab it and texted my mom asking her what to do. She told me to leave the house immediately and go to a friend's place until she got home. I peeked out the door and down the hall. The coast was clear. Summoning all my courage, I grabbed my skateboard, ran down the hall, and hurried out the front door. I stopped at the end of the driveway to grab my shoes, and then I hopped on my skateboard and took off, almost losing my balance a few times. When I arrived at my friend's house, I told him what I had seen, and to my surprise, he believed me. He told me that once, when he was staying at my place, he had woken up in the middle of the night while sleeping on the couch in the living room, which was right next to the kitchen. He claimed to have seen a dark figure standing there, staring down the hall toward the bedrooms. At the time, he thought it was a dream because he was half asleep, so he never mentioned it. We carefully returned inside the house to investigate when my mother and sister arrived home. Disturbed dishes were out of place and the cabinets were all hanging open. None of us wanted to stay there that night, so we went to our aunt's house, which was about 20 minutes away. The next day when we returned, everything in the house was back to normal except for one strange thing: all the lights were on. Since then, I've been a firm believer in ghosts and the supernatural. This just happened about an hour ago and I'm still shaken up. My close friend and I were at home by ourselves as we had been For a while, every time he visits, we go to the forest near my house, and usually nothing exciting happens. We toss rocks, snap some twigs, just innocent fun. But this time it was different. We headed outside towards the forest, and the walk there was uneventful. But as soon as we arrived, something felt strange. The area was unusually dark, and many trees were knocked down. It didn't look like the place I remembered. Despite this, we continued on messing around as usual. At some point, my friend turned to me and suggested we should head back. I glanced at my phone to check the time. It had only been half an hour since we arrived. I wanted to stay longer since we still had hours before anyone would expect us home, so we pressed on exploring further. Along the way, we found out things: a crushed soda can that looked like it was from the 90s, and an old wee toy booth that seemed even older. We decided to go deeper into the woods than we ever had before, which wasn't saying much since we'd never ventured far after While we reached a spot I recognized, it marked the farthest I'd ever gone in the forest. It was a makeshift bridge formed by a fallen tree over a stream. I'd seen it before, but this time something was different. Perched on the bridge was a small object. As we got closer, I realized it was an animal skull. It was clean and bright white, a deer skull sitting there like it had been placed intentionally. I had no idea who could have put it there, or what happened to the rest of the deer. Across the stream was a steep hill, and at the top of it sat an eerie little cabin. While we were looking around, a faint creaking noise or high-pitched sound came from the direction of the cabin. Startled us, and we bolted. My friend screamed as we ran, but I didn't stop to ask why. We didn't slow down until we reached the edge of the forest and stepped onto the pavement. Catching our breath, I asked him why he screamed. He said he heard footsteps right next to him. When we finally got back to my house, we noticed the garage door was open. Unsure if we had left it that way or if someone else had opened it. We ran inside and locked the door. I checked the house and turned on the alarm system. Still alone, I wished my family would come back soon. Now we're sitting here nearly 2 hours later, and the unsettling feeling from those creepy woods hasn't left me. I was at home one evening by myself. My family had gone to watch my sister's soccer match, so I decided to stay home and play computer games instead. Then, I heard a soft tapping on the front door, which was strange because we had a doorbell. I thought it might just be someone mistaking our house for someone else's, but then I heard a knock on the back door as well. I cautiously made my way downstairs, peeking through the window near the front door, but I saw nothing walking toward the back of the house. I froze when I got to the back door, where a man in his 50s with a scruffy gray beard and a plaid jacket was standing on the porch. He tried to get me to open the door, but something about his eyes made my stomach turn. I refused, and he yelled, "I know you're in there by yourself." As his efforts to break in became noisier, I heard the door frame cracking as he banged at it with shaking hands. Panic struck as he began hammering on the door, trying to force his way inside. Terrified, I ran upstairs and locked myself in my mom's office. I then grabbed the phone and rang 911. The man's pounding persisted until I eventually heard the far-off wail of sirens, and when the police arrived, the man had already left. My family returned soon after, clearly shaken by what I had told them, and they were relieved that I was unharmed but terrified of what might have happened. The police apprehended the man the following day, and that night I couldn't sleep because every little sound in the house made my heart race. I kept replaying the incident, wondering why the stranger had picked our house. The police said he was just a drifter who had chosen our house at random, but I didn't feel comfortable with that explanation. The following day, I began looking for answers. I learned that the man had a history of minor offenses and some serious charges. Something about this attack felt personal, so I looked online for any possible family connection. Eventually, I came across an old news article about an armed robbery at a local store a few blocks from our house, where the man had been arrested for threatening the cashier with a weapon. I was shocked to learn that my dad had witnessed the robbery, and I realized that the man had probably targeted our home out of retaliation. The police were shocked, but they promised to provide additional security even though the man was in custody. My family was shaken by the experience, so we put up a security system, began carrying pepper spray, and were more wary about allowing strangers inside. I even downloaded a safety app on my phone that included a panic button. I was disturbed for weeks after the occurrence. I had trouble sleeping and kept checking the locks before going to bed. My parents told me we were safe. Months have gone by since that night, and although the fear has subsided, it hasn't completely gone away. The experience taught me to always be on guard and follow my instincts. When I was 11 years old, I was staying alone in our small suburban house for the night while my parents were away visiting relatives. I begged them to let me stay behind, promising to follow all the rules and act responsibly. As the hours went by, though, I began to regret my decision. The wind was roaring outside, and the windows were being battered by heavy rain. To divert my attention, I turned on the television, but during every commercial break, I heard strange noises coming from outside. I kept telling myself that it was just the storm, but an unsettling feeling crept over me, telling me that someone or something was watching me and that it would be better for me to sleep through the storm. I turned off the TV and went to bed early. I pulled the blankets up to my chin in an attempt to reassure myself that I was safe, but as I lay there in the dark, I began to hear faint footsteps and murmurs. I told myself that nothing was amiss, but I couldn't get rid of the dread that was growing inside of me. I was positive that someone was in the house right outside my bedroom door. I lay still, my breath short, my heart racing. Paralyzed by fear, then just as I felt sleep tugging at my eyelids, a noise jolted me awake. It was the unmistakable sound of the doorknob rattling. My body froze as the knob turned slowly and the door creaked open. I clenched my eyes shut, thinking if I didn't look it couldn't see me, but then I heard it, measured, deliberate footsteps coming closer and closer to my bed. My fear finally boiled over. I sat upright, shouting, "Who's there?" The footsteps halted. A heavy silence hung in the air before the door slammed shut with a loud thud. Shaking, I stayed in bed for what felt like hours, too terrified to investigate. When morning finally came, I told my parents everything: the noises, the footsteps, the door. They laughed, dismissing it as my imagination running wild and blaming the storm for the creaking sounds. But I knew what I had heard. Someone or something had been in the house that night. From that moment, I never felt truly alone. Even in daylight, I would catch faint noises or see fleeting shadows out of the corner of my eye. I never found out who or what had visited me that night, and while everyone insisted it was all in my head, I know the truth. Something had been there watching me in the dark. I grew up in a quiet suburban area where the streets were lined with similar houses, each boasting neatly trimmed lawns and wooden fences. One evening, while I was sitting alone at home, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Jack was there with two older boys I had never seen before. They introduced themselves as Mike and Ethan, and although I felt a little uneasy, I invited them in because I wanted to appear cool in front of Jack's new friends. Jack was my closest friend. He was a boy who lived a few houses away, had a knack for starting trouble, and always seemed to have a new scheme. Mike and Ethan settled in right away. They stretched out on the couch and dug through the kitchen for snacks. I tried to strike up a conversation, but they were too preoccupied with their own heated argument to pay much attention. Suddenly, The room became tense as their voices became louder. Just when I thought things couldn't get much worse, Mike took out a knife, and my blood ran cold as he and Ethan started grappling on the living room floor. I saw blood, but I couldn't tell who was wounded. I was frozen in dread and didn't know how to respond. I was left to deal with the aftermath as Jack stepped in, managed to grab the knife, and helped me push them both out of the house. Neither Mike nor Ethan wanted to call for help or involve the authorities, so I scrubbed the blood off the floor and tried to put the room back in order. The thought of my parents finding out about what had happened scared me that night and taught me a hard lesson. The people you let into your life can sometimes bring unexpected danger. I made the decision to be much more cautious about who I trusted after that and never again placed myself in such a precarious position. When my parents first started letting me live alone without a sitter, I was around 11 years old. At first, it felt great to have this independence, but one night, while they were out, I was watching TV in the family room when the phone rang. I answered, but there was only silence. I hung up, and then the doorbell rang, feeling uneasy. I walked slowly to the door, not intending to open it, just to see who was there. When I peeked out, there was no one there, and then I heard glass break in the back of the house. I froze in horror, and as soon as I could, I ran out the front door and ran down the street to a neighbor's house. From there, I called my parents, who immediately called the police. Officers were already inspecting the house when my parents got there, claiming that someone had broken in and stolen several of our possessions. They assumed the intruder had been monitoring and knew I had been home alone for weeks. Even though my parents assured me that I was safe, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched every time the phone rang or someone knocked on the door. I also started having nightmares about that night and woke up soaked in sweat. One day, my parents received a call from the police saying that they had apprehended the burglar. It turned out that he had been watching the area and had noticed when my parents left knowing I was alone, so he chose to act. I was extremely relieved to learn that he had been apprehended, but the fear didn't immediately go away. For the next year, my parents resumed hiring a babysitter whenever they went out, but I never let my guard down again. While growing up in a small town where break-ins were practically unheard of, I put my dog on a leash in the backyard to let him roam and do his thing. Later, I went back inside and sat on the carpet in the living room watching TV when a commercial break started. Suddenly, I noticed a large figure behind me. One afternoon after school, I arrived home to find no one else there. The weather was warm with a hint of spring in the air, so I kept the main door open while keeping the screen door closed and unlocked. With my head partially turned toward the figure, I noticed in my peripheral vision that it wasn't a person but a large black animal. His breath smelled like stale cigarettes, and he started talking to me in a low, insinuating tone. I didn't like the way he looked at me, so I tried to move away, but he moved closer and reached out to touch my arm. Mr. Allen, one of the only people I knew in the building, noticed what was going on and moved in front of me to protect me from the strange man. Mr. Allen stayed with me, telling me that everything would be okay. He explained that the fire was probably a false alarm and that we would be back in the building soon. But I was still terrified and shaken, not knowing how I was going to survive the rest of the night. As the minutes went by, the situation started to calm down, and the firefighters finally gave the all clear, and to my surprise, there was no fire. I was relieved to see my parents when they got home, and I realized how fortunate I was to have Mr. Allen there to support me. It was like having a guardian angel watching over me and keeping me safe. I never really understood the value of having good neighbors and a sense of community, especially in an urban setting. I still think about that odd man who tried to entice me to leave the group, and I've never seen him again. A long time ago, when I was still in primary school, I believe I was around 12 years old. It was summer vacation and I was at home with my older brother. Our parents had gone out of town for the weekend, leaving us alone, and we were thrilled to have the house to ourselves and enjoy a sense of freedom that kids my age don't often experience. I'm pretty sure he didn't live in the building. He must have just been some creep who saw an opportunity and went for it. It served as a sobering reminder that dangerous people do exist and that we must be on guard. My brother, who was a few years older, was a bit too cool to spend time with his younger sister. He made plans to meet up with his friends at the park. Even though he was supposed to stay with me, I was a little disappointed he was leaving, but I understood he wanted to spend time with his friends. After he left, I settled down on the couch and watched some TV. The hours passed quickly, and before I knew it was getting dark outside. I got up and walked to the bathroom. As I was walking down the hall, I heard a loud noise from the living room, like the door had been opened. I thought my brother might have come back early, so I walked over to see him. When I turned the corner into the living room, I almost fainted. It wasn't my brother at all. It was one of his friends, Jim, who I knew as a real creep. I had issues with him before, and other girls in the neighborhood had complained about him too. My heart raced as I tried to stay calm and think of what to do. I quickly locked myself in the bathroom. While inside, I could hear someone moving around in the house. I heard footsteps down the hallway and then a knock on the bathroom door. I was so terrified that I was unable to react when I heard someone say, "Hey, it's me, Jim. I just wanted to talk to you. Come on, we can hang out." I knew this guy was trouble because he had a reputation for being creepy and getting into trouble, but I never expected him to break into our house. I remained silent and prayed that he would leave, but he persisted in knocking until my voice gave out. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, I heard a police car approaching, and Jim must have heard it too, because he fled right away. He probably thought I had my phone with me, but I had left it out in the living room. I cautiously exited the bathroom and opened the door to speak with the police. They searched the entire house and found no one, which didn't surprise me. They told me that a neighbor had heard me yelling and had called the police. I never found out who it was, but I wanted to express my gratitude to them for their assistance. I was also upset with my brother because I thought he knew how dangerous Jim was, but he still left me alone. I couldn't believe he had done that. I assumed Jim was at the park while my brother was with his friends, and when he heard that I was home alone, he must have snuck away and done what he did. When my parents returned, they were shocked to learn what had happened and were furious with my brother, making sure he understood how serious the situation was. They also took extra precautions to make sure our home was secure and safe. After that, I never fully trusted my brother's judgment again. I knew he could be reckless and didn't always think things through. The really frustrating part was that Jim played the whole situation off like he was invited. Since he was a friend of my brother's, he said he was just waiting there. It became my word against his, and he never faced any legal consequences for what he did. My parents did ban him from our house, though this was over 10 years ago, and of course I did eventually forgive my Brother, he was genuinely remorseful and technically no harm was done, though it was really close. My name is Sarah, and this happened when I was in the 10th grade. I got home from school around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, knowing it would be at least an hour before my parents came back from work. Usually I spent that time either watching TV or working on some assignments, but that day felt different. The moment I stepped inside, I had the strange sense that someone else was in the house. At first it was just an eerie feeling, a sense of someone's presence. Then I began hearing sounds coming from upstairs. At first I thought it might just be the wind rattling the windows or the old floorboards creaking, but when I listened more carefully, I realized they were footsteps. Someone was walking around upstairs. My mind immediately jumped to the worst possibilities. Could someone have broken in? Were they trying to rob us? Or worse, I tiptoed to the base of the staircase and glanced upwards. Standing at the top was the silhouette of a man staring down at me. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could tell he was tall and broad-shouldered. He wore a dark jacket, black jeans, and heavy work boots. My heart was pounding as I tried to figure out what to do. I felt frozen, not able to move. My leg shook so violently that I fell as I attempted to back away, even though the front door was just a few feet away. That's when the guy began coming down the stairs toward me. My legs finally moved. Instinct took over, and I ran across the yard to my neighbor's house. Mrs. Carter was a kind elderly woman who had lived next door for as long as I could remember. I knocked on her door, and when she opened it, her eyes widened in shock. I stammered out what had happened, and she quickly dragged me inside. We sat in her living room, and she gave me a glass of water while I tried to calm down. A short while later, I heard a car screeching away from my house. I assumed the man had left, but the possibility that he might come back frightened me. Mrs. Carter reassured me that everything would be all right, so she called the police, who came in a matter of minutes. They searched the house, but they couldn't find the intruder, so he left. Later, we found that some of my mom's necklaces and a few other valuables had been taken, totaling less than $800. Maybe my escape scared him away before he could take more, but for weeks after that, the man was never apprehended. I was too scared to be in the house alone, so I kept the lights on at night and was always watching over my shoulder. Eventually, the fear subsided and my life returned to normal, but I will never forget that day because I often wondered what might have happened if I hadn't run when I did. It was a close call, and I'm glad I was able to escape in time. One evening when I was 12 years old, in the early 1990s, I was watching TV at home when someone knocked. It was dark outside, and I couldn't see who it was through the peephole, so it was obvious to whoever was outside that someone was home. My parents had always warned me to be wary of strangers and to never let anyone in when they weren't there, so I was apprehensive. I opened the door just enough to see a man who appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s. He was courteous as he stated that he needed to contact for assistance since his automobile had broken down. I was hesitant since my parents had always cautioned me about such circumstances, but I didn't want to turn him away if he really needed assistance. I asked where his car was and he pointed down the street, but when I looked I couldn't see any vehicle. I also found it strange that he had passed the two houses next to mine, both of which had cars in their driveways. It made me think he chose my house because it might look like no adults were home. When I mentioned this, the man became irritated and defensive, which made me even more uneasy. We went back and forth for a while. He insisted he needed to use the phone, but I suggested he try one of the neighbors instead. Finally, I decided the best thing to do was to close the door and lock it. As I shut the door, the man began yelling and cursing at me, calling me all sorts of names. Remember, I was only 12 at the time. I stood firm and refused to let him in. It was an obvious choice. At that point, I heard him stomping away, still shouting angrily, and felt a wave of relief that the encounter was over. I went around the house and double-checked that all the doors were locked, though I was pretty sure they already were. A few minutes later, I called my parents to tell them what had happened. They were worried and told me to stay inside and keep everything locked, which I assured them I had already done. I sat nervously on the couch waiting for them to come home. Thankfully, nothing else happened that night. When my parents returned, I was incredibly relieved not to be alone anymore. The next day, they spoke with several of our nearby neighbors, but none of them had seen the man or had a knock on their doors. My dad thought the man might have been scoping out the neighborhood to see which houses were easiest to break into. At the time, all the other houses near us had cars in their driveways, which could explain why he chose ours. In the days that followed, we noticed a suspicious car driving around the neighborhood. I never got a good look at it, so I couldn't tell if it was the same man, but it seemed like it could be connected. My parents reported the incident to the police, but nothing ever came of it. We never saw that man again, and life eventually returned to normal. However, a few weeks later, one of our neighbors, an older couple, was robbed. While we couldn't know for sure, I've always believed the two incidents were related.